smart anything, anywhere, everywhere. I'm not sure about the smart part, but I'm definitely sure that I'll be talking about almost anything, everywhere connected vision. So I'm a kind of new kid on the block. So I just recently moved in Cambridge University. I've established a new group, Internet of Everything. So I'll be introducing my group as well. Is there any pointer here? Okay, sorry, I wasn't meant to do that. See, I'm very bad at these type of stuff. Okay, no laser pointer, I guess, it's fine. So this is kind of a very rough evolution of communication technologies. As you know, we've been using, since the ancient history, we've been using some pictures on the walls of the caves. We've been using smoke, pigeons, visual telegraph by Claude Chappé, French inventor, electrical wires, and then tons of different versions of electrical communications, including radio waves, 5G, etc. And I'll be talking about some kind of science fiction, but not that much. It's happening right now. Molecular, Internet of Molecular Things, bio-nano things, Internet of Senses. So I'll be going through all different Internet of X people are talking about or working, spending money, spending their time, okay? So I'm not in any way suggesting that we are working in all of these, but I just wanted to, go through and elaborate and show the possible research directions. Like even people are working on Internet of Senses, very interesting direction, in my opinion. Neutrino networks, this is an actually neutrino transceiver, well, not transceiver, but the receiver. It weighs 19,000 tons. It should be larger than, this is an actual picture of a research consortium in US called Minerva Consortium. It should be this building size. People are working on gravitational communication networks. There are patents on this. There are labs spending money for using gravitational wave, which has been just physically proven a couple of years ago, as you know, in Stanford. And bottom line, Internet of Everything is kind of a vision that we have. So, so what do we mean by Internet of Everything? So, mass is energy and energy is information. Everything is connected to each other. So we can really, if you have the energy, you can convert it to mass or the other way around, theoretically speaking, of course. If you have the information, you can even, with the Siller's engine experiment, I cannot go into details because I don't have time for that, but we can talk about it later on. You can even convert information into energy. So everything is actually kind of connected. I'm not talking about some philosophical or abstract view here, but that's also the case. When we say Internet of Everything, we're not talking about just Internet of Things, like this microphone, our watch, our wearable devices that connect to each other, but more actually like some part of our tissues, certain cells, like several parts of cardiomyocytes in our hearts, they're also connected. They might be connected, and you may want to connect them to the rest of the Internet. How? Through different communication technologies, not necessarily electromagnetic waves or whatever. We need to think out of the box. So in that sense, Internet of Everything is actually around us. By the way, Internet of Everything is coined by Cisco, not in this direction, but it was kind of Internet of Things plus processes and algorithms and some behaviors. So this is kind of a little bit further extending it. And actually, there are tons of examples of this, like Internet of Genes or gene regulatory networks inside us make us, healthy people or unhealthy people. Or the entire human body you can think of as the most complicated communication system. So if there is a communication failure in your nervous system, then you have MS or Alzheimer's even. Tons of different illnesses. So communication is related to certain processes inside human body as well. So in a very recent work, some parts of the brain are conventionally associated with certain behaviors, like thinking analytically, and emotional thinking, listening, vision, etc. But what has been recently shown that the creativity is not associated to a certain part, but the connectivity among all these parts. Okay, so connectivity is very important in that sense. So people are starting to think about all these processes inside human body and outside in the entire universe from the communication perspective, with just the idea of getting further insights to help solve some engineering problems. So in our vision, universe is basically the Internet of everything, connection of anything that you can think of, okay? So it's already surrounding us, and our vision in our research is to understand the rules and the dynamics from communication engineering perspective. I'm a communication engineer by education, so I've been working with physicists, I've been working with life scientists in all different directions, trying to understand different communication design principles, basically, to come up with some new technologies for artificial networks of, let's say, nanomachines, or networks of certain cells inside body, or even people are trying to do the same thing to realize new communication technologies between planets, for example, like nutritional or neutrino communication links. So, but if we look back a little bit to Internet of Everything, you know, this is a kind of superposition of all the definitions that you can see in the literature. So a framework in which all things have a representation in the internet, all things meaning physical and virtual. So physical things basically include, in our vision, everything up to the molecular level. So these are some of the IOX. People are spending time and money, as you all know very well, industrial Internet of Things, taking a lot of money. I even had some market analysis with some companies. That is the top-ranking IOX, so to say, that, you know, big companies are backing up. Internet of Bio Things is just emerging, and we will go through some of these. They have basically some common challenges, like enormous number of interconnected entities, close interaction, blah, blah, you know all these, but basically enormous number of interconnected entities, but with interaction requirement between heterogeneous technologies, not only heterogeneous technologies, but totally different worlds, require looking at the problem domain out of box again. So these are a little bit detailed view of the key challenges. By the way, I'll be going through some of these a little bit fast, and I have several references underneath. If you're interested, you can send me an email. I can share these slides with you. Okay, no problem with that. Because I'll be going a little bit fast. So like one problem or one salient feature of Internet of Things, or in general Internet of Everything, is in addition to, you know, classical challenges like connectivity, scarcity of bandwidth, energy, efficiency, etc., is the application-driven networking. So you have a specific application in mind, so your solutions should be tailored to that specific application, okay? But at the same time, we're talking about Internet of X, so we need to be connecting that application to the internet, requiring interoperability. So these things seem to be contradicting. So how are we going to solve all these? Unfortunately, I will not be talking about much on the solutions part. I'll be introducing more problems, including some of the preliminary work we have done and others done. Okay, so we will start browsing from the molecules to the universe side. So the first thing that I can introduce you is, briefly introduce you, is the Internet of Molecular Things. So what do we mean by molecular things? You may remember, yes, last year, one of the Nobel Prize awardees was the inventor of the nanomachines, and he had the vision. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the fellow, but the idea was that, you know, we need to have these nanomachines, several of them in place, doing a job together. So how are you going to have something, several, in together and do job together? You need to communicate them. You need to enable communication among them. So how are you going to communicate nanomachines? You cannot attach the, you know, our classical wireless radio transceivers, etc., right? You need to do something else. So what we have done was, you know, we looked into the existing classical nanomachines in the nature inside us, and how are they communicating? Basically, they are communicating with molecular communication, so to say, okay? In terms of different attributes of molecules, like concentration or types or you know, their polarization, charge, whatever, you know, tons of different properties. You can encode the information and send it, hopefully receive it, and decode it, voila, you have the communication, right? Well, it's not that easy. One example of that was just one, and this was practical, was based on first resonance energy transfer, which is FRET, or further resonance energy transfer, which is very well-known phenomenon in bioengineering or physics. It has been used in tons of different applications. The main idea is that you have a protein molecule here, another one here, donor, acceptor, okay? They should be very close to each other. I'm talking about several tens of nanometers, okay? 10 nanometer, let's say, in the scale of. It should be a fluorophore protein. What happens is that if you excite the donor, which is, let's say, transmitter, with a laser from outside, this guy starts to oscillate and emits a photon. It's fine. You don't care about photons, right? Photons are everywhere. But what happens is then when the oscillation spectrum of this guy overlaps with the acceptor, then there's a non-radiative energy transfer. So if there's an energy transfer between any entity in the universe, then we can embed information on that, right? We can modulate it. It's easier to say than it's done, but we can do it. And actually, we have done that. In an experimentally, you can download the audio files, etc. We have even passed the Bob Dylan's House of the Rising Sun before he was actually nominated for the Nobel Prize. So that was the first practical molecular communication, artificial basically, realized in the lab. So what is the use of this? I don't know. I mean, I can imagine many uses, but I cannot do it because I need to excite these protein molecules. The idea was to embed it inside human body so that they could be, gateways or transducers to the outside, but I cannot excite the proteins inside the human body with the external laser source for the time being. But if I can extract or scavenge or harvest sufficient amount of energy inside the body, then this might be a possibility later on. For a little bit, farther idea of Internet of Everything, let's say. So there are tons of opportunities for collaborations. So I'll be talking about these at the end if I have time. So in all these directions that we have worked so far. So Internet of Nanobio Things is another direction. So that was just for the molecular communication perspective. By the way, Internet of Nano Things has been listed as one of the top 10 emerging technologies in 2016 by World Economic Forum. So this is really happening right now. And ComSoc, IEEE ComSoc, has also listed this, both IoT, IoE, and molecular communications as one of the emerging trends in 2017. So these are really taking up right now as a very young and interdisciplinary research directions. So what we do here is basically, in one of the grants that I had from ERC, is that we wanted to understand the nervous system from communication perspective with two objectives in mind. One is to extract some design principles to really, again, realize artificial communication between that small, tiny stuff. Because we know that nervous system is an excellent communication system, thanks to a million years of evolution. But it's not that easy to understand what's happening there. Of course, we're working with life scientists. So that was the first objective. But the second and more exciting objective of this project, which is still going on, is that if we can really understand what's happening there from communication perspective, maybe we can really relate some of the diseases to communication failures. But some of them are quite obvious, like spinal cord injury, for example, right? It's a very mechanical communication failure. Or even multiple sclerosis. It is basically, there are tons of types, but the loss of the myelin sheath, which is kind of the interference over the coaxial cable where you lose the insulator around it, or similar to the interference between two base stations. We know how to solve interference. Channel equalization techniques and all. Can we use our engineering, not us only, but human beings' engineering technologies to help life scientists to solve some life science problems? So these are the directions that we are following in the Internet of Everything. So some other people are also working in this field. Like the leftmost one is the new bio-cyber interface we have designed, but we will be implementing here in Cambridge. But the middle one is from Berkeley, from Alex Zettel lab. It's an actual picture, not a drawing, of a radio. That's an AM radio receiver. Transmitter is very difficult. so what they can do is that they can receive an amplitude modulated radio wave basically and demodulate it and listen to it with this very tiny radio. So they have been working on trying to realize the transmitter counterpart of this. It is difficult because of the physics, but if they can do it as a system standalone device, then it is, in my opinion, one of the transceivers that we can use to realize Internet of Things, because you can actually attach it everywhere you like. But there are tons of challenges ahead. Other people are working on graphene-based terahertz transceivers inside laboratories. So addressing all these different challenges. So I'll a little bit speed up here. So again, one of the directions for communicating the spine with the graphene-based neural interfaces to the rest of the internet, or to the problematic part of the rest of the spinal cord, let's say. Another very interesting direction is to do the molecular communication using different types of materials inside a room. Instead of using acoustic or electromagnetic wave, can we use simply a certain set of molecules to communicate between myself and my fellow over there, which cannot be detected by any of the classical detection methods. You can imagine there are tons of applications. Okay, so I'm wrapping up. So the rest are basically tons of different directions, which I do not work on directly, but I'm aware of that. There are many references, again, as I told you before. If you're interested, I can share these slides with you, no problem with that. And you can further elaborate. So Internet of Senses is a fantastic direction that people are trying to pass a sense, all senses basically, of a human being to some other place in other time on the surface of the Earth. So this is not just communicating or replicating the view of the camera here. It's just trying to send the senses of the cortex to some other place. It's a very interesting direction. There are some projects going on in the US as well. Internet of Sensors, classical direction, but with energy harvesting stuff, it's again very important. We had very nice talks in the morning session. I think there's a nice opportunity to go for it. Very large scale, battery-free, totally battery-free and passive sensor networks again. So 5G, let me go. Internet of Energy, again, another direction, coined by some other people. Pass the energy and communicate and carry the energy together. So I promised my session chair, and I'm trying to keep my promise. I'll finish in the next minute. Is that okay? Great. Okay. Internet of Vehicles sounds quite obvious, but Internet of Battlefield Things, it's very interesting direction. I know DARPA reserved several $100 million for only Internet of Battlefield Things, not on Internet of Things. So you can guess the meaning of Internet of Battlefield Things, but it's a very emerging field. I've been an evaluator in one of the panels there, so there are tons of projects being proposed, and researchers are working on this. This is more classical. Non-classical one, Internet of Money. Bitcoin has just dropped 2 days ago, but still people are working on Internet of Money. Very interesting direction. I have no idea about money and all, but if you're interested, you can further elaborate. And Internet of Space, including even Google are spending a lot of money on space exploration, and they're trying to now send thousands of devices around the planets, not only Earth, but around Mars and several others. So how are we going to communicate all these? The classical internet-based communication techniques will not work with that high latency channels and very, very problematic channels. So all these challenges need to be addressed. So this is the open issues, but basically I have already talked about all the open issues so far. I haven't even mentioned any solution. I'm aware of that. So if you're interested, you can go over all these. And so let me stop and thank you, everyone. So this is my current team here. We're expanding, and there are tons of, not tons of, I should revise. There are some postdoc and PhD positions as well, and we would be very happy to collaborate with any of you guys here, including ARM as well. Thank you very much.
there's some applications there I just never imagined with Internet of Things. So amazing. So we've got time for some questions. Any questions?
It was too confusing. Sorry about that.
Maybe I will start actually.
It was too fast. Sorry. Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions. So one is very interested in the Internet of Things in the body. What sort of timescales what do you envisage for that sort of thing?
You know, if I answered, very nice question. If I answer this with the first example, Internet of Molecular Things with Fred, it is a very slow process. So you should not be aiming any real-time application. We're talking about several minutes to realize certain transactions. So like what we could achieve at the end was several bits per second.
This is with the AM.
No. That's another application. That's much faster than that. But that's not, again, unfortunately, intra-body application because there is some issue with carbon nanotube putting it inside the human body, you know, biocompatibility, etc. Yeah. And yeah. So all these applications are not necessarily aiming for real-time, like video delivery or whatever, but mostly for interfacing what has not been interfaced so far to the rest of the world. So reliability is the issue instead of the time scale.
Okay. Any other questions?
Sure.
Hello, Omar Castilla from University of Manchester. Just a question about all the areas you mentioned, which you didn't have time to explain much.
Yeah. So I have this 4 hours version of this talk where I go into.
I can imagine you can go through 4 hours completely. But my question is in regarding to all of that you mentioned. Do you see that being integrated as an Internet of Everything or something like that in the near future? Or how do you see this going to?
Excellent question. The shortest answer is no. I'm not expecting it to be integrated very soon. But they're actually inherently integrated. So that's the vision. So we keep that vision, and of course, we're just working on one piece of this whole picture. But all the other people and groups are working. They are also aware of that, you know, there will be, at some point, interaction between these different worlds. That's why actually we're trying to, you know, interface body to the internet, for example. At some point, yes, but in the, you know, near, no.
How many years do you think?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't know. I don't know. I mean, maybe tens of years, something like that. I'm not talking about hundreds of years. People are quite aggressive in these directions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So
thank you. Oh, I should leave this, right?
Actually, I have another.
Oh, okay.
So, good starting for this afternoon's session, so thank you. So now I'd like to introduce Philip Stanley Marvell, who, again, from the University of Cambridge. So, talk is Haggis. So I'm looking forward to some bagpipes and clicks. Haggis, hardware privacy guards for integrated sensor-driven systems. So over to you.
Great. So there won't be a Burns dinner. So I'm Philip. I'm a new university lecturer in the Department of Engineering, and I lead the Physical Computation Laboratory. It's a new research group. Today I'd like to tell you about which we're starting. So it will be primarily an overview of the research emphasis in our approach, and hopefully you'll get some insights into what we are planning to do. But first, I felt a bit left out by Osgur's wonderful talk, so I thought I should have a human in my slide, so I very quickly added. That is, as many of you know, Enda Kenny. He's the Taoiseach, or he was the former Taoiseach or Prime Minister of Ireland, and he's sitting looking very patient at a man wearing a smartwatch. So this is some tall man who has a role similar to the role Enda had. Now, many people have devices like the tall, thin man was wearing. And most of these devices, like the very old-fashioned Fitbit, which I'm wearing now, do not have microphones or GPS. I think that is something which is very clearly understood. Because it is ever cheaper to integrate sensors into devices such as wearable health tracking devices, environment monitors either in rooms or out in the world powered by solar energy or by some other form of energy scavenging, there are ever more sensors integrated into devices. Quite often you will find devices like a barometer or an accelerometer in a device. So this is a teardown of the Fitbit Charge 2. Now, it turns out that you could use these very mundane sensors, such as accelerometers and barometers, to do things which microphones and GPS could let you do. So shown on the upper side of the slide is a 5-kilometer radius picture of San Francisco, of a map of San Francisco, together with an elevation map of that area of San Francisco. And on the upper right is a similar map, an elevation map for Cambridge. So as you can probably tell, the elevation variation in San Francisco is very different from what it is in Cambridge. And so if you're walking on Van Ness Avenue in San Francisco, the variations in elevation and hence the variation in atmospheric pressure which you would witness would be very different from if you're walking on, say, Huntington or Adams Road. Based on this insight, several research groups, in particular Mani Srivastava's group, have proposed techniques to use variation in pressure to estimate where you might be walking. So that's one way in which you could use a very mundane sensor, such as a barometer or pressure sensor, to more or less detect location. It's not going to be to meter accuracy, but you can get some information out of that. Another example is using an accelerometer for sound detection. So shown on the lower left is a time domain plot of data gathered with an accelerometer. To be very specific, it was a MMA 8451Q from Freescale. And this is showing the accelerometer in the presence of two tones, a C5 tone, or 522 hertz, and a A4 tone, 440 hertz. And this is the frequency domain spectrogram. Now, as you can tell from the spectrogram, there's a fair amount of aliasing. But the bottom line is, because of the sampling rates at which you can sample from this and similar accelerometers, with a reasonable amount of signal processing, you might not be able to record high-quality audio, but you could very well, at the least, do things such as detecting that there is a human speaker. So, based on these observations, our decision was to investigate ways in which we could develop hardware which could be integrated into future sensors to do the following. What we would like to do would be to have logic, either digital logic or analog circuits, which could be integrated into sensors such as accelerometers, gyroscopes, barometers, and what have you, so that the data which they provide can be configured at runtime to still provide the needs of legitimate applications like a pedometer, but to prevent malicious applications such as audio recording or location detection from making use of the data generated by the sensors. So that's the goal. Our research hypothesis is that we can synthesize what I will refer to as hardware privacy guards, and that we can do that both in the digital case, so for a sensor with, say, an I2C or SPI interface, as well as for sensors with analog interfaces. Now, the approach that we're taking is to develop a domain-specific language for describing the valid uses of sensors and to synthesize either the digital logic or the analog circuits from that interface description. So today I will share with you two components of this very nascent work. One is the Sensor Access Interface Description Language, or SAIL. And second is a hardware platform which we're developing, which I have an instance of here, to enable the research which we're doing in this direction. So the idea behind SAIL is very easy to describe. Given algorithms which use sensor data, such as a pedometer, and given sensors which provide that data, we would like to define or synthesize logic which sits in between the two, so that this data satisfies the constraints described in the sensor access interface description. So the SAIL description language enables the following things. It provides operators for referencing the history of accesses to a sensor. It likewise provides operators for describing properties or invariants which these histories should obey. And its primitives are designed to enable easy synthesis or to ease the process of synthesis to hardware, be that digital logic or analog circuits. So let me show you a very brief example. So shown here is a SAIL policy. And think of this as a hardware description of the data needs of a pedometer application. And let's focus just on these 5 lines over here. So this describes a number of properties which the history of sensor accesses should obey. And I'll walk you very quickly through it. So first, there is a history of accesses from all clients of a sensor. This operation obtains the average rate at which samples have been obtained from the sensor, and likewise the average effective number of bits of samples obtained from the sensor. And future accesses, or at any point in time, accesses to the sensor should only be permitted if the sample rate on average is less than or equal to 20 hertz, which is what is needed for a typical pedometer application, and if the effective number of bits per sample is less than or equal to 6. So that's a very simple example, and I hope it gives you a high-level idea of what a SAIL description looks like. So given such a description, our objective then in the case of both digital interface sensors or sensors with analog interfaces is to go from the SAIL description through a synthesis step to obtain an RTL netlist, which we can then map to a FPGA, or which we could then provide to a sensor vendor to be integrated into the interface of a sensor. Now, there are a variety of techniques which we could apply in the digital and analog cases. Highlight one example of techniques we can apply over here. So one of the objectives is to be able to reduce the effective number of bits per sample obtained from a sensor. So imagine you have a sensor with an interface which provides, whether it's 8 bits per sample or 14 bits per sample or 24 or more bits per sample. And what we would like to do is, without changing the interface of the sensor, so without changing the protocol which you must follow to retrieve samples over I2C over SPI, we would like to effectively re-quantize the information which is provided by the sensor so that the effective number of bits, even though you're still receiving 14-bit words or 20-bit words per sample from the sensor, we would like to re-quantize that information so that the effective number of bits per sample matches the SAIL description. So we've developed a technique in our previous work called value deviation bounded serial encoding, which achieves this objective. And to give you a concrete idea, to do this re-quantization for 8-bit data, no idea what happened. To achieve this re-quantization for 8-bit data, the synthesized hardware requires only about 60 lookup table entries on the Lattice Semiconductor ICE40 FPGA. Or if you had to map that with an appropriate technology mapping library, maps to about 900 gates. So that's a fairly small interface for doing this re-quantization. If you are interested in trying out this subcomponent of the larger Haggis project, there is a tool which is available online from the research group's webpage, and you can specify within the tool the number of bits per sample and the level of re-quantization, and you will be able to download the VHDL code for, actually, we have versions for both VHDL and Verilog, and the version online will allow you to download just the Verilog code. So that's what you could do in the digital case. What about in a situation where you have a sensor with an analog interface? Clearly, everything I've described so far is not going to work. So what could we do? Now, the research challenge is that we would like to be able to do this reconfiguration of the sensor's interface for a given application. So fundamentally, what we need to have is a way to have effectively a programmable analog interface. So how do we do that? Well, it turns out that my research group doesn't have the specific expertise to do that, but there are folks at Toshiba who do. And so we partnered with Toshiba in Japan, and they've made available to us a field programmable analog array device, which they are bringing to market. And so using that device, we can go, again, from a sale description through a compiler or through a synthesis tool which we're developing to obtain a circuit netlist, which we then map to the field programmable analog array. So this is a brief overview of what that device is. It's a fairly simple in the good sense, small device. Comes in a 24-pin package. And what it contains is a number of analog components shown on the right here, which can be interconnected in any arbitrary topology, configurable with software. So it contains a few comparators, a few op-amps, a bandgap reference, a few logic gates, and several PMOS and NMOS transistors, and a few resistors and capacitors. And of course, you could put together multiple of these to create a larger interface. So one concrete example of what such an interface would do would be, for example, to implement a bandstop filter in an application. So if we had these hardware privacy guards, we would clearly need to evaluate them within some concrete evaluation platform, because having the research result on its own would not necessarily indicate that our idea would be valuable in a deployed system. So the challenge which we sought to address was, is there some existing sensor platform which we could use in our research to evaluate these ideas, or is there a platform which, or would we have to design our own platform? Now, these are the research requirements which we set out for such a evaluation platform for the sensor privacy guards. First, it should be a state-of-the-art multi-sensor platform, so we should have a wide array of sensors for different modalities like temperature, pressure, humidity, and so on. We should have the ability to integrate new integrated circuits, so we should have the raw CAD files so we can make modifications. And ideally, the hardware should have support for us to do things such as control the supply voltage of the sensors, and to have complete control not just of the digital interface to the sensors, but also of the analog environment within which these sensors operate. So to do that, we have designed a hardware platform called Warp, and that's the platform shown in the video on the right. So the platform, unfortunately, the video has sound, so you now know what my old hardware lab sounds like. Anyway. The platform contains several sensors. It contains 11 different sensor integrated circuits. These different sensors cover 6 modalities. So there are 2 accelerometers, 2 gyroscopes, 2 humidity sensors, 2 pressure sensors, 2 photometers, 2 magnetometers, and 2 barometers. In addition to the set of sensors shown on the right-hand side, there are 3 other major capabilities. One is an energy scavenging subsystem so that the entire platform can run off scavenged energy. And second is a set of hardware facilities which we designed to allow us to trade off the accuracy of data obtained from sensors for the power dissipation used, or for the power dissipation of the sensors. So having said all of that, you might wonder, well, okay, so maybe you have a system with hardware privacy guards, but what if I snatch your Fitbit off your wrist during a security check, and I replace a sensor in your Fitbit with another one which now has a MEMS microphone embedded in it with exactly the same digital interface? So how could we get around that? Our observation, or an observation which we made, was that if you look at the temperature profile as you make repeated accesses to a sensor, that can give you a unique signature for that sensor. Shown here are thermal images of one of the sensors in the Warp platform. the thermal image is effectively a 120 by 120 set of temperature readings, so 14,000 temperature readings. And this is when the platform is just turned on, and this is after making 100 readings at a sampling rate of 1 hertz. So clearly, at least from an external observer, you can see that in simply making 100 accesses to the device warmed up. That should not be surprising. But one way in which you can use this observation is to note that the heat capacity of each package will be different. And so if there were any modification to it, the rate at which it would heat up would be different. So what you could then do would be to say, build a fingerprint of each device in the system by making such characterizations of multiple temperature readings, and use that fingerprint in the future to validate whether or not a sensor has been compromised. So shown here are such temperature profiles for 4 sensors in the wall platform. This happens to be a temperature sensor, but the BMP-180 is a pressure sensor, and the BMX-045 is a multi-sensor module, and this is a magnetometer. But they all, as do most, or at least many sensors, contain temperature sensors. And what you can see from our preliminary data shown over here is that with these hundreds, or with these sets of 100 temperature readings, the signatures which we observe are very different from device to device. There are several challenges yet to be addressed. These challenges include taking such sets of readings and turning them into a succinct signature. One thing you could do would be to fit this to an analytic model and keep the model parameters as your signature, but that is much easier said than done. So today I've given you a very quick overview of the Haggis project, and specifically I talked about 2 things. One about the SAIL Sensor Access Interface Description Language, and about the WARP hardware platform. The work I described is in collaboration and with the support of Toshiba in Japan and IBM Research in Zurich. So I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that the research my group does, or that I'm the head of a new research group in the University of Cambridge, and the focus of the group is as follows. Our objective is to take an understanding of the physical world, so things which interact with sensors, and to take an understanding of the way in which such embedded computing systems interface with humans, say displays, and to use these 2 understandings to design embedded computing systems which are more efficient. In doing this, we have several directions of research. Today I talked about SAIL, which focuses on the sensor side. There's also work or a sub-project called LAX, which again focuses on the sensor side. There's RAKE for communication, there's the Crayon project for displays, and there's of course WARP, which influences many different parts of the system. So that's it. I believe I'm exactly on time. Thanks.
Exactly on time. Perfect. Thank you. Great. Any questions? Come on.
Jeff Merritt, University of Southampton. So one of the great things that smartphones has done is put a very rich sensor platform into the hands of every person, and as a result, lots of new applications have come out that those sensors weren't designed for.
Right.
If we move towards this kind of guarding or limiting of those sensors, aren't we actually stifling the innovation that we're going to get through future platforms?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question for several reasons. One very important reason is that what we're proposing here is not a fixed guard, but a guard which can be programmed dynamically at runtime. And so we're not at all advocating that you should go from using a sensor which has a 14-bit interface and has an output data rate or ODR of, say, 800 hertz. What we're actually advocating is that sensors should keep improving in terms of the resolution and sampling rate, but for a specific application or for a specific deployment, say if, let's pick a concrete example, the Fitbit Charge 2, I believe, uses a accelerometer from from ST Micro. I think it's the LIS DH20, I think. But say they pick that, they could then apply SAIL they could effectively apply a Haggis guard around it so that that sensor still meets the needs of the pedometer application, but cannot be co-opted dynamically to record audio, say. So you raise a really good point, and that is exactly why we're advocating having a programmable interface. So just one follow-on to that. Likewise, in the case where you have sensors with analog interfaces, what we do not want to do is to say, fix the low-pass filtering, which is done at the sensor side. Rather than fixing that, we want to have a way to dynamically configure an analog circuit, which would be the dynamically configured filter, which restricts for a given application. Did that answer your question?
Any more questions?
Yes. Very interesting talk. I was quite interested about the size of your cell interface. It seemed very small and very compact. In energetic terms, is there a price to pay for this in terms of the processing and energy cost?
Yes. So let's see if I can quickly go back to two things. Right. So for a digital cell interface, or for a interface synthesized, or for a digital interface synthesized from cell, at least for the requantization, the overhead is about 900 gates. Whether or not that has a high energy cost is going to depend on several factors. So for example, a sensor vendor will typically have the MEMS component, the analog front end. The analog front end is probably not going to be in 10 nanometer CMOS because that might not be the best for that kind of system. So let's say it's in 90 nanometer or 65. Whether or not the overheads of the interface outweigh the benefits would depend on how efficiently this could be implemented in the specific implementation technology. So I could give you, I don't want to give you a cop-out answer and say it depends, but it depends.
Great. That's probably it. All the time we've got time for questions, but if you've got any more, we could ask them after the session. Great.
Come catch me, babe. I'm falling. Come save me, baby. I'm calling.
This is from Manuel Vesper, and this is real-time 3D sense understanding. Over to you, Manuel. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Hi everyone, can you hear me? Yeah. So I'm a third year PhD student at Imperial College London, and I'm going to present this work, which is about computer vision, and in particularly the problem of simultaneous localization and mapping. So first of all, a couple of definitions. So what's this problem called simultaneous localization and mapping? So it's the problem that given a sensor, which can be a camera, you want to jointly estimate the camera position and an idea of the world that the camera is actually observing. So some sort of, you want to estimate the map, like how the environment look like. We are actually focusing, I mean, there are various flavors of these techniques, and we focus on dense LAM, which essentially means that the geometry you recover of the world is completely dense. You can recover the full continuous mesh of the world, as you can see in this picture. In these algorithms, usually you can exploit some sort of depth sensor, like the Kinect one, in which all the stream of depth images get fused into a coherent representation, which give you back the full geometry reconstruction. So this method in particular is called kinetic fusion and is a volumetric method. What does it mean, volumetric? It means that the world is represented in a cube, which is discretized in voxels, and each voxel holds the distance from the closest surface. So as you can see in this picture here, if this red line is the actual surface, you can see that the voxels around them, they contain like distance bodies, and the actual surface in the voxel cube is encoded where the value is 0, so the 0 crossing of this implicit representation. Below you can see the algorithmic pipeline of this algorithm, which is a closed loop. So you get an input point cloud from the depth sensor, you align it with the previous point cloud, so you can recover your position. And once you get your position recovered, you can actually fuse the new data into the representation. The next step is render the word that you have just observed in such a way that you can use this prediction to align with the next depth frame. And this goes on in a tight loop. So okay. So in this work, we're going to talk about octrees. So which is a way of representing efficiently this volumetric function. Why is that? Because usually volumetric methods are really expensive. It means like that to cover, like for instance, 10 cube meters at 1 centimeter resolution, you need at least 4 gigabytes of memory, which is a lot. And there's a lot if you think that the actual word is mostly empty. So most of the word, I mean, most of the space encoded doesn't hold any meaningful geometric information. So, for instance, these are like 3 scenes from a data set we use, and in red is are the voxels which don't hold any information, while in blue are the voxels that hold significant information. So clearly there is a huge there are huge opportunities to exploit all this sparseness, this inherent sparsity of the word. So clearly in the literature there are like 2 main approaches. One is based on a hierarchical data structure like octrees and cube trees, and the other one is based on flat hash tables, so voxel hashing. And this is actually the state of the art. But in this talk we will actually focusing on the theoretical less efficient data structure, which are octrees. So why do we think that octrees are interesting? Well, first of all, they accomplish the task, which is exploiting sparsity. But they don't just exploit sparsity; they also act as a spatial index of the scene. So the tree structure already gives you like the structure of the word that you're looking at, and you can exploit that for various tasks like collision detections or navigations. So it's a richer data structure which can bring you like huge advantages, and I think it's important to have an efficient implementation of it. So what's an octree? Just to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So if this is a cube, which it is, an octree, roughly. So an octree is a regular recursive decomposition of the cube. So each dimension is divided by 2. That means that you're creating like subsequent octants as you go down in the level of recursive. So we have a big block which is divided in 8 cubes, which is divided recursively in other 8 cubes, till a certain maximum level of split, which defines your actual resolution. What's the problem with this data structure is that, well, it's a tree, and whenever you want to operate on it, like in parallel, you have to be clever and you have to do stuff very efficiently, because they have an inherent overhead compared to just dense pre-allocated voxel grids. So in this talk, in fact, I'm going to describe, it's going to be a bit technical, but I'm going to describe our efficient information fusion algorithm in this data structure, our simplest strategy, which is required to actually extract data from this data structure, and concluding like our future work to bring all this stuff in real time to small CPUs, to really mobile CPUs. So first of all, I'm going to describe the data structure. So what's the actual data? So as I said, actually, I'll just go back 1 second. Just forget one piece of information. So this is the volume. This is the function we are encoding. An important bit is that information is just encoded in a bandwidth. Outside the bandwidth, so the bandwidth is close to the surface. Outside the bandwidth, there is no information at all. So that's where the sparsity comes from. So now going back to where we were. So that means that the only voxels we are interested in are the ones that are close to the surface, which contain actual information. So in this perspective, we can see voxels just simply as an array of aggregated blocks which contain meaningful information, and the octree, the data structures that allows us to index and retrieve the correct voxel given a query position. So as I said, like the octree is a regular decomposition of the three-dimensional space, which also encode the structure. So we have internal nodes, and each node has 8 children, which can allow you to, descending the hierarchy, to retrieve the correct voxel block for a given query position. So if you recall, the pipeline first starts with the alignment, and once the alignment is done, we have to fuse the new information into the tree. Now the problem is the tree is actually empty at the very beginning, so we have to populate the tree, and we have to do it fast because otherwise you lose completely the advantage of using a sparse data structure. So we have first to infer which voxel blocks need to be allocated, and we do this by raycasting the scene from the current depth image and retrieving all the intersected voxel block along the along the truncation region. So in this way, we collect everything that needs to be allocated on the map. Now the problem is, we need to do this, as I said, we need to do this allocation in parallel as fast as possible, because this needs to be like in the 30 millisecond budgets. So how do we do that? So we have a particular strategy based on Morton numbering. So for those one of you that are familiar with space filling curves, this is not new, but I'll try to give you an example of what a Morton number is and why it's useful in our case. So I think the easiest way to think about Morton numbers is like a linearization of three-dimensional coordinates. Essentially, given a three-dimensional position, x, y, z, you combine those 3 coordinates in one single number, which uniquely identify the voxel. There is an example down there. So if you look at the bit pattern of the x, y, and z coordinate, 1, 3, 0, you interleave, you get that number down there. Why is this interesting and crucial? Well, they have an interesting property, which is the prefix of this number identify the parent in the tree. So as you can see, so given this node here, all these children share the same prefix with the parent node, and we exploit this property to do allocation very, very efficiently. So essentially, our algorithm is we first sort all the codes that need to be allocated. We get a prefix for the first for the level of the tree which we are allocating. We remove the duplicates that will be generated because parents share different children, and we allocate those nodes entirely in parallel. What's the key here is that once you start from the root and you go down to the next level and the next level, you're always sure that the previous levels are being allocated. So you can do the allocation fully in parallel without any synchronization. So the only synchronization that you have is the barrier at each level of the tree, and this turns out it's a big winner. So once we've done that, we can our tree is being allocated. We can just collect all the voxels that have been allocated, and we can update them. Which way? In the way that I say. So for each voxel, so let's say this point here, to allocate that, we just need to take the distance and do a moving average of these estimates. So how does it look like? This is like, for instance, a render of that. So this is the living room, and this is what it looks like when you reconstruct it. As I said, the next step in the pipeline is to actually render a view that you will use to align yourself with the next frame. And this is done by raycasting. Now, raycasting is pretty expensive. It's already expensive in a regular grid, but it can be dramatically more expensive in a tree because of the latency that you have to access the data. So it's absolutely fundamental to do that sampling as efficiently as possible. To this goal, we have developed like this cute algorithm. So in this slide, I will describe what the problem is, which is subtle. So as I said, like the word is a collection of aggregated voxels, right? So when you do a sample of a continuous field, you do usually trilinear interpolation, which means that you have to collect 8 sampling points and linearly interpolate between them. Now, if your sampling point ends in the middle of a voxel cube, you are good because you have all your points local there, and so you pay just 1 tree traversal per 8 points that you have to gather. If you are less lucky, let's say you are very unlucky, you actually end up in a corner between like all different voxel blocks, in which case you have to collect, to pay all the tree traversal to retrieve the proper points. And then there's the middle case, which is some points are local, some are not. And it turns out like that dealing with this situation efficiently is fundamental, because if you gather those points in the wrong order, you're gonna pay many more traversal of the tree compared to what you should be doing. To explain that, this slide explains that. So let's look on the left. So if you need those 4 points and you gather 1, 2, 3, and 4 in that sequence, essentially what you're going to do is to pay 3 traversal every time. I mean, 2 traversal more than what you should be doing, because you will invalidate what you gathered before. Even if you cache it, you're still going to invalidate the cache. So what you instead we should be doing is to traverse the tree, to gather the point in the order which maximizes locality. So in this case, it would be 1, 2, 3, and 4. So to do that, we simply noted that well, this can be statically pre-computed, and we simply at compile time we generate a lookup table that can give you the right order, the right sampling order, given the point position. So just at runtime, you just have to select the correct traversal order, and this is quite a big performance advantage. So this is the building block of the sampling. To retrieve the actual surface, you have to raycast, and that's where the octree actually gives you a lot of advantage, because you can simply skip completely empty space by casting a ray, traversing the boxes from big from coarse to fine level till you get the first leaf block intersect, and then you can do the sampling in a sequential way. This is pretty much our work, and I will show you now some results. So the results we have collected. We have implemented these pipelines on CPU for one reason, because so these algorithms usually they are very well suited for GPU computing, because they are massively parallel computations. But the GPU could be busy actually doing something else, like the natural application of these algorithms can be augmented reality, virtual reality, so you might need to do rendering on top of it. Or in other situation like flying drones and so you might not have a GPU. This computer doesn't plot the shall I? That's embarrassing, sorry. That's a problem with
Maybe just describe the results.
should be.
Yeah, can you just describe
Yeah, so what I was going to show is so what I was going to show in that slide. Yeah, this is a problem with Windows EPS rendering. Sorry. What I was going to show in that slide is a massive speed up of like 12 times compared to a dense voxel grid, and I was going to show as well that we match and even beat like flat hash table data structures, which are like algorithmically faster, and yeah, the main. So that was the main message. So that essentially exploiting sparsity is a big win. And the second message was if you implement octrees right, you can match the performance of flat data structure, which are actually algorithmically faster. That was the main. And then we can reach real-time performance purely on CPU, a result that a couple of years ago was achievable only with very high-end GPU processors. And I don't know. So,
Come catch me, babe. I'm falling. Come save me, baby. I'm calling.
So those are like frame per second. So you can, you can see that we are there. So what I want to get to is that, yeah, we have demonstrated. What I was saying is that we have demonstrated like real-time performance on CPU on algorithms that were before obtaining this kind of performance only on fat GPUs like Titan X, that kind of class, and the spatial index you gain by having octrees can be useful in a variety of applications, and that's what we were interested in, and we are applying that to robot navigation at the moment. And finally, what's the future work? Where the thing is, we're getting on CPU now roughly 30 frames per second on a desktop class CPU. If we want to move to real mobile processor, we have to do much less work. We must optimize a lot this algorithm, and technically that means both algorithmic improvements, which can come in a variety of ways, but also low-level optimizations, which is where ARM actually, I think, can come into play, like full pipeline vectorization, efficient memory layout, and branch divergence minimizations. But also, why not dedicated hardware platform? Although these algorithms are like a sort of moving target because they're evolving very fast, people are looking into dedicated hardware for this kind of reconstruction, and surely, they are very well suited. And that's pretty much it. Sorry about the delay.
Technology always gets in the way. Questions?
It was interesting. You talked about GPUs, and you kind of hinted at using multi-cores to handle that. But one of the key things you showed was the Z pattern for your access, right? And the texture cache would give you many benefits, but you didn't really. So what was the implication on your CPU caches? I'm assuming you're not getting very good access patterns. Even though you pre-computed the addresses, you're not going to be getting, prefetching, streaming prefetching into the caches.
No, the thing is, so essentially, like the memory, I think the memory-intensive operations is when you do that linear interpolation, I think. So that's where you, right?
That's mostly true, I think, but you still get the cache will be prefetching into the caches, which I'm assuming you're not getting. You might get it, I just don't know, unless you're sorting your cache lines as well in there. we can talk about it afterwards.
Yeah. So now I see where you. So you're saying like so the Morton layout is not actually enforced at the. So I said that we aggregate like voxel blocks, right? So you have we're talking about like 8 cube voxel, so continuous memory, right? And they are not sorted in
Exactly.
they're not. Yeah. Maybe an internal Morton layout could actually could actually improve the cache.
It might. But once you go to embedded processors, that might be an interesting thing.
But in fact, actually, this is all part of the memory layout optimization and vectorization that we're going to explore. Actually, we know. So this work was mainly like lay the foundation, the algorithmic foundation to get like an efficient data structure, and then now we're starting to look into more low-level optimization, like of this sort. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks. There was a question over here.
So you mentioned you used a data set from TU Munich.
Yeah.
Did you compare to any of the work from Daniel Kramer's group, like LSD Slam? I couldn't tell from the results.
So we haven't. Yes, we have. Not in this presentation, but we have done several papers in which we compare. We have one particular paper on about LSD Slam compared to this particular algorithm. Actually, it's a sort of it's a weird comparison because they are completely different pipelines which do completely different jobs. So if you're just interested like in tracking performances, which is what 2IM dataset allow you to do, maybe yes, you can compare them, but they also give you like a completely different type of map. So yes, we do compare against that. Yeah. Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Come catch me, babe. I'm falling. Come save me, baby. I'm calling.
Okay, so on to the final presentation in this session. So let me introduce Jordan Rakoff from Aston University. So Jordan is going to talk about non-invasive real-time occupancy estimation using single PIR model. Thank you.
Hello. I'm Jordan. I'm currently based in Aston University, but this work has actually been done during like my internship and Charles' internship in ARM. So most of it has been done with them in collaboration with Emre, with Charles Leach, with Ganesh, with Jeff, and with Max. Here's a brief outline of my talk today. First, I'm going to introduce to you the problem of actually counting occupants and occupancy estimation, since most of you are not familiar necessarily with that particular application, and some of the related work, or the main ways that people have approached this problem, and what is the fundamentally different way in which we proposed and kind of like patented to solve it. Then I'm going to go through like what is the data collection that we did, how we've evaluated the whole system. I'm going to talk about also like two types of modeling approaches that we took, which are probably algorithmically quite different to what we saw today, because they're not going to be based on deep learning. And then we're going to move on to like the evaluation, which we report some formal accuracy, computational efficiency, feasibility checks, what you'd need to deploy, and we're going to conclude with actually fair amount of limitations and discussions of what future work is needed for this project, and this is obviously like can be subject to some future collaborations. Okay, so what is the problem we're trying to solve is how do you estimate the room occupancy? There are two main ways in which people have tried to solve this problem, where probably the most popular one is using like video cameras, which cost a lot of money, and usually deploy something like some convolutional neural nets or some other deep learning image recognition algorithm, where they detect essentially human silhouettes, and then we kind of like count how many of those are there in an image. We're gonna like call that sort of methods person counting sensors that cover the entire area of interest, because essentially the algorithm that you have, you rely on having a device that kind of like monitors everything that you can estimate, and then you have an algorithm that counts number of things in it. And then there's like entirely different set of approaches that have been proposed, which use not expensive, like the cameras are very accurate. The problem with them is that they're very expensive and sometimes cannot be used in real time, and obviously can be problematic whenever you're dealing with crowds. Now, the second sort of approaches, they're cheap, but they're hard to install, and they rely on simple sensors like either pressure sensors or like passive infrared sensors. You place them essentially at the gates of the environment you're trying to monitor, like for example at the entries and the exits. You're hoping that you're going to be able to catch with a passive infrared sensor the direction of movement, and you're hoping that people will be coming one at a time or leaving one at a time. If they don't, things get complicated and they don't work. The systems don't work too much. And the problem is that also once you enter the building or the environment, you kind of like lose track of what's going on. So that can be quite problematic once you scale to larger buildings, because pretty much you get it wrong once and then you don't have an opportunity to correct for that mistake, because unlike the first type of methods. There's obviously like a third approach which takes use of both, which essentially you have passive infrared sensors attached to cameras, and then those cameras like switch on only whenever there's like sufficient motion or some gestures or some pattern. But that sort of like expensive security systems are typically mostly used in kind of like military applications or like for the police or that sort of thing. And we're not going to really talk about them because they're more expensive than the first group. What we're going to suggest here, and what we will try to convince you that you should consider doing, is using a passive infrared sensor, so a simple cheap sensor. We use it in the category of a person counting sensor. So instead of just like scratching the surface and counting how many people are passing through a gate, can you use this actually instead of a camera, compensating with essentially a different setup of machine learning algorithms that you use to analyze this data? So just to kind of like show you, for those of you that are not familiar, the passive infrared sensors are simple motion sensors. And they have like some field of view of like 100 degrees, 100 degrees top view, and then horizontal view of 82 degrees, 5 meter detection range. And they pretty much flicker around whenever there is motion. So if you look at the passive infrared analog setting sensor for 30 seconds, you'd see something like that, where the bumps up and down increase, like the variance increases whenever you have more motion, and it kind of like it's nearly stationary whenever there's less motion in front of the sensor. Okay, so if we manage to do that using a single passive infrared sensor instead of a camera that monitors some environment, if we manage to kind of like make a useful occupancy counting system from it, the advantages would be that this will be very, very cheap. So this, because a passive infrared sensor costs like $1 or $2 or something like that. The other big advantage, it was mentioned earlier in another talk, is that it's non-invasive. We really like, whenever we're deploying monitoring systems in the wild, in offices or in our houses, we really want this not to take a picture of us every time we go to the bathroom or go to switch offices, or we're on Facebook or whatever. And the third thing is that they're also very easy to install. Like the cameras, you just place that system, like we demonstrate that we just place the system inside of the room and then we do our stuff, unlike the passive infrared sensors that require quite sophisticated installation actually at the gates in order to work. And obviously there's going to be some challenges that we need to consider and we don't completely solve in this work. And this is kind of like, is it going to matter? Is it going to be dependent on what is the room that you're using to collect the data? What are you going to be doing when there's like multiple occupants occluding each other's view to the sensor? Also, is there going to be like a maximum number of occupancy that you'll be able to detect with that sort of approach? Like if the crowd is too big, will one sensor still work? And that sort of thing. And then there's like, probably the biggest problem is that I would like to point out that we're trying to estimate occupancy from motion. So there's like a high problem of latency here, that we're not directly counting neither heads nor anything. We're kind of like trying to do a sophisticated pattern recognition task. So okay, let's start with how we actually did the whole setup. So we have like an arm embed with like attached passive infrared sensor, which is like connected to a laptop just for the power purposes, and you place it around different offices in the ARM Cambridge sites. We obviously asked for consent, and then we traveled like switched around different rooms, different meetings in order to collect data from meetings with different nature, like whiteboard sessions, formal setup meetings, slide presentations, shared conference calls, and that sort of things. And we also varied the location depending on sunlight, occupancy capacity, and that sort of thing. We collected about 75 meetings, but only 65 of them were actually usable because kind of like people push the sensor, they break stuff. It was a mess. At the end of the day, about 53 meetings, 53-hour recording was the clean, trustworthy data. The rest was kind of like I decided to exclude it just because I wasn't 100% sure what am I recording. And I would sit down in front of the room for each of those things and count how many people are going in and coming out. Where the thing is that, to be fair, we're kind of like not using the data from when a person is coming in or coming out, because then it gets too easy and then we can get even higher accuracy. We're just hoping, can we recognize how many people are there based on their motion patterns rather than on the opening of the door or not, which creates a significant indicator of is there a change in occupancy. So okay, so let's see how kind of like a glance at how the data looked like is like, for example, you would have for 30 seconds data. If you have 0 people, we get something like the purple line here, which hardly moves at all, and there's no variation. Then the green line denotes 2 people. You see the kind of like it's nearly stationary, then it jumps, then it's stationary again. Then for 9 people, you see more variation, and then once people get more than 9, it becomes even more varying. So we kind of like notice that there is a general trend, that the more variation there is in the output, that there's going to be like more occupants. This becomes even clearer as you take like a longer window of passive infrared data. If you take 25 minutes, for example, you see that the green signal is from 9 people, the red one is from 2 people. So I can probably safely say that the more variation there is in the signal, there is going to be more occupants. The question is, how accurate is that going to be? How much can I quantify that? So what I did is, okay, just a simple mathematical check. What is the distribution of that raw data? Just do a histogram of it. And then we see kind of like that's a textbook Laplace distribution. That the data, like at the top, you can see that for 45 minutes, as long as I take a longer duration of data, it's a nearly textbook like Laplace distribution with a spike at 1, which is only due to the saturations of the sensor, because the passive infrared sensor is saturated at values of 1. And then once you start reducing the amount of data that you're using, the data is less perfectly Laplace distributed, but still kind of like we can see that fitting a Laplace distribution to this data is going to work quite well. Furthermore, I want you to point out that notice that the position of that Laplace distribution, essentially the distribution I'm fitting, it stays the same, and it's only the variation of the data that kind of changes. So if we just do a simple linear regression and kind of like plot the spread parameters of that Laplace distribution against the number of people, we can kind of see a nearly linear trend. You see, with just a log linear trend towards the end. So we were like kind of happy because we were like, oh, we nearly solved it. It looks like just based on that spread parameter value, which is a single feature, we can kind of predict how many people were there in the room for that duration of time. Where the location parameter, as you can see, it's hardly useful at all. But then, that was just a simple linear prediction problem where, to be even more accurate, you can split it, you can stratify to like a linear problem for spread parameter values in that range, and then a log linear problem where you have a stochastic switching principle whenever the spread parameter values are in an interval 0.8, 0.1. Okay, but the problem that we had is that the Laplace parameters that you saw there, each one of those stars was estimated from about 100,000 data points. That's the passive infrared data for a whole duration of 1 hour. And you don't want to wait 1 hour to receive a real-life occupancy estimation of what was going on in the room. So what we want to do is we want to see how does the performance changes as we start looking at data not for 1 hour durations, but for smaller durations of like 30 seconds or 2 minutes. Ideally, you want the spread parameter value, which is your single feature that you use for prediction, to stay constant, to stay the same. But in red, I've plotted the spread parameter value without doing anything of that raw data. And you can see that for the same meeting, same count of people, it doesn't stay the same. Like here you have 2 minutes. Every 2 minutes I'm estimating that feature, and it kind of bubbles around, which means that my system is going to be predicting different number of people in the room, although they stay the same. And it's in fact even the same office meeting. Once you switch to 30 seconds, feedback every 30 seconds, things get even messier. The blue line fixes it, but I'll go to that on the next slide. So now what we noticed, what we realized, which was also mentioned earlier, is that when things are stationary, when nothing's happening in the room, you can kind of like quite clearly predict what is the occupancy based on motion. The problem is when things are going on, like when there are things happening in the room, what do we do? And we were thinking, a natural way really is just to segment the raw data so that you kind of like know when something's happening and when something's not happening. And we're looking for, okay, can I just look at the segments in which nothing's happening pretty much, and it's just things are nice and calm, and use this data for the prediction, and the rest of the data ignore or filter out. Then the mathematical problem was, how do I do that? And we came up with like a Bayesian, like a some sort of a traditional, but also like novel contribution towards that end, and it was based on advances in Bayesian on-parametrics, in particular Bayesian on-parametrics infinite hidden markov models, which you essentially train on the data and they kind of like automatically learn how many clusters are there in the data. The points that are in the same states, in the same clusters, are going to follow like more similar dynamics, and the ones that are indifferent look different. Essentially, in this particular case, you can see that the red points are significantly more varying than the blue and the green. And the nice thing about it is that you do it in a completely unsupervised way. I don't need to know what the people are doing within the room. I just kind of like detect how many different regimes of movement are there in the room without any prior information about it. Then question was, how do I kind of like automatically say all the time which are going to be the behaviors of like normal movement and which are going to be like high variance movement or like very involved movement? Well, the simple thing really to do is to kind of like deploy the system in the different rooms when nothing's going on. There's not even a single person there. What are the clusters that I'm going to pick up? In this particular picture, those are going to be the green clusters and the blue clusters. Then, if I kind of like deploy the system in occupied rooms, I'm kind of like ensured that those two clusters, because they're trained on that data as well, they're going to be less variant than the new clusters that will occur. In this particular picture is the red cluster. So then, it's kind of enough to say, look at the data and don't really consider the red cluster. Because when there's a red cluster, there's too much going on for me to kind of like translate motion into occupancy, ignore it, and just focus on the remaining green and blue clusters here. So once you do that, you can kind of like estimate again that simple feature, Laplace spread parameter, based on every 2 seconds or even every 30 seconds of data. Now that's going to be plotted in blue on both plots. What we observed is that clearly, although the problem is not 100% solved, you can kind of see that your spread parameter values for each meeting and for any occupancy level barely changes throughout the different windows. So it means that even if you're not 100% accurate of what is going to be the occupancy estimation level, you're going to really be logical about it, and you're not going to be switching the occupancy count every time someone like walks out or sneezes or does something that involves more movement. So in order to kind of like quantify that, what we did is first we did a box plot of like, okay, let's assume I don't filter any data, and I just feed the raw data to the system, estimate a single feature, and use this feature coupled with a linear regression to kind of like predict the occupancy level. So if I just plot the data, and I'm waiting like 45 minutes, so I'm giving feedback on every 45 minutes, I'm using data from 45 minutes essentially in one go, you can see a clearly linear trend, everything's 100% predictable, with where the crosses here are essentially data that is not described by my model. So when there are many crosses, it's a bad thing. When there's no crosses, it means my data is nice and I can predict everything 100% pretty much. So for 45 minutes, you see that without filtering, I do very well, linear trend. But once I go into kind of like that's the number of people, and that's the spread parameter values. Once I go into like feedback every 30 seconds and analyzing data 30 seconds at a time, you can see that without filtering any behavior, without actually segmenting the behavior of the people in the room into different regimes, we do pretty bad. We start like our data no longer can describe, like our system no longer can kind of like fit the framework of what's going on, and we pretty much fail on 30 seconds. Now, let's assume that I actually use that sort of suggested segmentation approach. We see that for 45 minutes we do, well, still pretty well. Still pretty well for 45-minute observation time, which makes sense. And then once we reduce to 30 seconds observation time, it's not great, but you still see a significant improvement, where furthermore the crosses here occur only at the first and at the last like occupancy levels, which kind of makes sense because essentially means that your system would be outputting there's too many people now for me to be accurate, or there's like 0 or less people, so I'm going to be, so as long as it's at the border edges, you kind of like have nice interpretability. Now let's quantify that in terms of accuracy. We're going to measure what is the percentage accuracy of your system outputting an occupancy level that's within one of the true, or in the brackets within 2 occupants of the true occupancy. And we see that if we're just using the raw data and we're not doing any filtering for 20 minutes, both methods are quite comparable. But then once you start reducing the window size and giving feedback quicker and quicker and quicker, not doing any segmentation, behavioral segmentation gets worse and worse and worse, while doing essentially behavioral segmentation keeps some sort of robustness, where you can still not provide the same level of accuracy that video-based systems provide, where you're here at a very cheap price. Now, next stage was like, okay, that's all nice. It looks like a nice idea, but you're going to say, how do I deploy that? Can I actually make the training work online on a microcontroller board that doesn't have any memory or any CPU time? Well, if you use traditional training algorithms for infinite hidden marked moles or any sort of probabilistic moles, which rely on MCMC sampling or on variational Bayes, stochastic variational inference, gradient-based descent algorithms, it doesn't work. You're requiring about 100 to 200 iterations just to fit your behavioral segmentation model, which means that you're going to be too slow and you're not going to be able to run it on board. So we suggested the iterative map approach, which is kind of like greedy, but it's still going to, we think it does good enough job in terms of mean absolute error, almost the same in fact, but in 6 iterations. Furthermore, we noticed that if we train using a traditional approach, offline the system, and then we deploy with a greedy algorithm on the microcontroller board during the inference, we're actually not losing any accuracy. So then the next stage, what in fact Charlie did is he implemented this in C++, and we put the iterative map algorithm to work online continuously on ARM embed boards. So we used Cortex M0 board and Cortex M4F. So one has, they both have like different memory and different clock speed. What we note here, the purpose of the exercise is to see, okay, how long does it take to analyze, to cluster data of 30 seconds, and how long is your battery, a normal battery, is going to live if you're working continuously all the time. What we notice is that Cortex M0, we do not claim that the algorithm has been optimized as much as possible, but we've tried to do quite a lot of mathematical optimization on my side and also like implementation optimization. We notice that the Cortex M0 platform does process segments data of 30 seconds for 95 seconds. So that means that you're not going to be able to cluster the data before the new data comes along. But then the Cortex M4F clusters it in 1.15 seconds, mainly because of its floating point capabilities. And this is fast enough, and we can actually even increase the feedback time to less than 30 seconds. Furthermore, we noticed that the life of the Cortex M4F will need to change its battery to recharge it only once every 36 days, which we thought that essentially once a month for an office environment, it's quite a feasible setup. We had a demo, but unfortunately I didn't bring it today because it's too many people for it to work. So just to conclude with some future directions, we're planning on one thing that would be very interesting is to see how can you develop this system to work with more than just a single passive infrared sensor. Can you use other non-invasive sensors such as CO2 sensors? All the algorithms would stay the same most likely, but there would be some additional calibration in order to improve the accuracy and in order to make like a separate product out of it. Then we also can extend the system. I actually have done some trials on that using more advanced switching dynamical models rather than HMMs, things like non-parametric switching linear dynamical system or switching autoregressive models. Then you can actually capture particular gestures like entering the room, exiting the room, or like some hand waving and that sort of thing with quite high accuracy, and use them in different ways depending whether you need occupancy or you need some emergency thing or detecting walking or not or whatever. And then we also the work can be extended if we test different PAR sensors at different locations, maybe place it at the ceiling, maybe place one at the wall, and see how kind of like if we use two sensors at the same time that have field of view towards the room, how much are we going to improve the accuracy? And that's it for me, and here's some work we've published on the topic. On bottom is algorithms, top is the actual work we did with Emre. Thank you.
So we do like to have meetings in ARM, so I'm surprised you managed to find a meeting room that was empty to take our photos. Any questions?
In the comparison between the M0 and M4F, was it a floating point implementation which you compiled down to the M0 and the same to the M4F, or did you have a fixed point implementation for the M0 and
it was fixed point, I think, for M0 and then floating point for. We did change the implementation a tiny bit to make use of the actual floating point.
Any other questions?
Quite interesting. If the, I mean, in your test, you had everybody doing a fairly standard procedure. They sat down and, you know, in a meeting room at a table. What would happen if it was a dance hall, or you know, or let's say for whatever bizarre reason at ARM, everybody decided to do a song and a dance?
Well, I mean, the main thing is that obviously we try to test it in as many different environments as we can, but obviously in an office, people don't really dance as much, unfortunately. So algorithmically, the main thing that you'd need to do most likely, obviously that's a little bit of a speculation, is that you keep the algorithms the same, and then you kind of like, whenever you deploy the board in a different environment, like a dancing studio, you'd leave the board for like a couple of hours, or maybe even like 24 hours or 48 hours. It's going to learn the segmentation patterns, which are the main trick in this system. And then, only after 48 hours, it will start getting better, essentially, because it will learn what is the segments that are kind of more typical for dancing studios. You might need to review it once it does 48 hours in order to adjust everything. You might need to do some hand calibration potentially. I cannot claim 100%, but the idea is that you need to retrain now the segmentation algorithm in the new environment for a limited amount of time before you can trust the system, unless you do offline training on anything possible that people can do in a room.
Thanks, really interesting talk. I want to ask about the different kinds of sensors. So it seems like your PIR sensor is the kind of cheap solution, and the kind of video camera with all the you know, image processing expensive solution. So are those the two ends of the spectrum? And like you said, CO2 sensors somewhere in the middle perhaps, or is there something cheaper and smaller than the PIR that would do a really bad job but would be much less
I think the
expensive?
CO2, to be fair, we might be able to do with similar algorithms and similar system a pretty good job as well. It's like, I'm not really sure of what's the market value of those sensors. The main separation that I see is like lower dimensional sensors, like, for example, accelerometers, passive infrareds, and that sort of cheap sensor, both cheap in terms of data and in terms of price. Because essentially, whenever it's a low dimensional sensor, you don't need to use expensive algorithms, which means you can learn them online. So if you say both price is both amount of data and processing and the amount of device, then yeah, I would say that definitely the video and the high resolution thermal cameras are on the expensive side of the spectrum. But then it's arguable whether the passive infrared is the cheapest sensor you can use, or a combination between a switching combination between a passive infrared and a CO2 might does better job per processing time and price. We haven't really explored that in detail, but it's an interesting question.
Any other questions? All the way at the top.
Thanks for the talk. It might not be a fair question because CO2 is in your future list, but I wonder, how soon does the CO2 level actually change when people enter the room? Like if it was a really short meeting, 5 to 15, 20 minutes, would it actually be useful at all?
Well, I mean, and it obviously depends on the size of the room. If you're looking at a very small room, then you might expect to see some change. But this is why with Emma, we thought that passive infrared is a good start to have at least as one of the sensors, because this is something that a change in pattern, the fastest I managed to detect was about 10 seconds, but we didn't do a formal evaluation. While for CO2, you'd be looking at least a few minutes, no matter how small the room is. And if you're looking at something like that with a few sensors at each bottom, you really want to have a combination of a fast sensor and a CO2 rather than just a...
If the AC kicks in, doesn't that dramatically change what your sensor is reading?
Well, yeah.
There's a joke in there about hot air in meetings. But I won't go. Any other questions? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Okay, so that concludes the session today. What I will do is just, so it's a coffee break now, but there's an introduction to ARM research, which is held in the main auditorium. However, if that's full, it's also going to be shown here as well on the screen. So that's 4:30 main auditorium. Thanks very much.
Come catch me, babe. I'm falling. Come save me, baby. I'm calling. save me, baby. I'm calling. Come catch me, baby.